So in that example, that does give your political party leverage. So even though you're not formally in a coalition, we like to call this the no-alition, you still have influence and power. There's this sort of tacit power that gives you. What preconditions would be on the table in order for that to happen, right? So we as the Free Market Foundation have a core set of mostly economic policy recommendations that we would like to see come to fruition. So in terms of the economy, what is the biggest concentration risk, the biggest choke point for South Africa? It's the state-owned enterprises.
Welcome to another edition of the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham, and this episode is brought to you by Pace Car Rental. So if you need to rent a car, go to Pace Car Rental, use our secret code SONA, and you will get a discount. So you can't say no to that deal. As we all know, the election's over, nobody got a majority, and there's lots of talks going on. And even every day brings a new story. By the time you watch this, there may even be more talks about which way our new government is going to be formed. Obviously, there's a lot of talk between coalitions, a lot of talk about governments of national unity, and lots of talks about minority governments. And one of the voices that has been very pro a minority government has come from the Free Market Foundation, not the Freedom Front. That's a whole different place. The Free Market Foundation. And with us today is an old friend of the State of the Nation. That's the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, David Ansara. David, welcome back to the State of the Nation.
Mike, it's always good to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
So, David, I saw a press release that you put out where you are talking about a no-alition.
Yeah, so a no-alition, as you alluded to, is essentially a confidence and supply arrangement between the major parties. As you pointed out, the ANC doesn't have enough to form a majority on its own, but it does have the plurality of the votes. And its options are quite stark. It either goes into a coalition with the so-called comrade parties. This is to borrow a phrase from Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, who's a writer for the Daily Friend and a journalist. Comrade parties are, of course, the EFF and Mkhonto weSizwe, Jacob Zuma's outfit. And then the other option is a coalition with the Democratic Alliance. And what we've been saying is that this actually is a false dichotomy, and we've been making this argument for many months now, even preceding the elections, that there is another option, another way, which is confidence and supply. And it's a fairly technical term, but very simply it means that the Democratic Alliance in this case would be able to provide support for the election of the president, which we assume will be Cyril Ramaphosa as the candidate for the ANC. And so will implicitly then also not support a vote of no confidence against the president. So that's the confidence component. And then supply is around the budgetary process. So the DA in this hypothetical case would agree to support the appropriation bill and then rubber stamp the budget when that is passed on an annual basis. But other than that, it stays out of government, not a formal coalition. It resumes its role as the official opposition. It holds the government to account and ensures that it represents the interests of the voters who voted for it, the 21% of the electorate who supported the DA. So there are many advantages and disadvantages. Life is about trade-offs. You can never have perfection. But we think that this will be the most balanced approach to governance. And the reason we think this is because we feel that the ideological foundations of the ANC and the DA are so diametrically opposed. They come from very different political traditions. And this might create a lot of internal contradictions and tensions that would make governing in a so-called government of national unity, however you want to label the coalition, would make governance very complicated and would actually potentially harm the Democratic Alliance in that it might be lumped with the failures of the ANC government. So that's our position in a nutshell. Confidence and supply rather than a coalition.
We have got a bit of a track record with something similar. This is how, after the 2016 local government election, the Democratic Alliance basically ran Johannesburg, I think even Tshwane and Kuruleni and Port Elizabeth, as it was then, on the same basis, with the oddest partner as well, and that was the EFF having a confidence and supply agreement at metro level, voting with the DA, and using those votes, the DA managed to govern those metros for a good 3 years, right? Until such time as it didn't work, because you are sitting at the back of the room with a loaded gun, really, in this case, aren't you?
Yeah, so in that example, that does give your political party leverage. So even though you're not formally in a coalition, we like to call this the no-alition, you still have influence and power. There's this sort of tacit power that gives you. And in the example that you gave, the EFF there was very much knew its bargaining power and its leverage and exercised it quite effectively. Not to the benefit of the citizens of Johannesburg, of which I am one, but to its own particular interests. So I think in this example at the national level, this also enables the DA to keep its powder dry. The no-alition gives it that distance from what would inevitably be some of the failures of the new incoming ANC government.
Before we go into this deeper, let's talk about the other forms that have been spoken about and the pros and cons of both. Coalitions. Why do you feel that coalitions aren't appropriate? And what is a coalition versus a confidence and supply agreement?
So a coalition is where the parties formally enter into government together and share power, typically on a proportional basis. So some members of the minority party, in this instance the DA, might be allocated specific ministries. So there's been some talk that the DA might want to get the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Competition, whilst the ANC retains control, for example, over Treasury or Ministry of Justice, whatever the case might be. And in that sense, there's this term in South African politics that the cabinet bears collective responsibility. And we're very skeptical of this idea of collectivism. Sometimes it's actually a way of dodging accountability. But in this instance, it would be used, I think, to the detriment of the DA. Because now, imagine the electorate comes to the ballot box in 2029, and they're thinking about the last 5 years. What was the track record of governance over these parties in this government? They won't necessarily disambiguate between one party and the other. They will look at the levels of unemployment in the country. They'll look at what has been the record of economic growth. Has my personal material circumstances as a voter improved, or have my conditions worsened? That will be the basis upon which they might make their electoral decisions. So, in that sense, the collective responsibility is the key distinguishing factor and might also be part of the difficulty of such an arrangement.
And what about a coalition with the comrades? What would be the problem there?
Well, the coalition with the comrades would be fairly calamitous, I would say. I think I'm more concerned about a potential coalition with the EFF. That would also require some small parties to join that coalition. The EFF is around 9.5% or so. The ANC on about 14.5%. So that's still 40.1 or something like that. So they'd still need.
They're just short.
Yeah, so they'd still need one smaller party, but perhaps they could get that from the PA or what have you. But that would require a hard tilt to the left. There would be, again, conditions on that participation in the coalition that I think John Steenhuisen refers to it as the Doomsday Coalition. I don't think that that's an inaccurate label. And the policy program of the EFF is very clear. Nationalization of the Reserve Bank, which would debase the monetary supply. The nationalization of key industries, mining, for example. Commercial banks are also in their target sites. And then the big danger is to private property rights, which the EFF said they want to expropriate land without compensation and so on. So I think that is definitely a scenario to avoid. But I think there is a question around whether or not the EFF would even be interested in doing that. As we discussed earlier, they understand the power of also withholding their support. And the EFF has branded itself as an oppositional force that rejects the status quo. And we see recently that the EFF also has what would you say, rejected the offer for joining the government of national unity. There's also this personal animus towards Cyril Ramaphosa as the president. That would be a condition, perhaps, of their participation in such a coalition. Would be that the president would have to recuse himself. I don't think the president and those around him want that to happen. So that already imperils the so-called Doomsday Coalition.
I sometimes wonder, and this is when you get really risky, if it isn't time for South Africa to do the dice with the devil and actually have that coalition, because there are certain ways that a government can and can't behave. Sadly, I'm old enough to remember when the ANC were coming into power and their policies were just as ridiculous as the EFF's policies. And I think it took about 15 minutes after Nelson Mandela was inaugurated before they changed all of their policies because they were unworkable. And the rest of the world, descended on them and said, good luck if you think that you're going to nationalize banks and nationalize mines. Let me show you what it looks like. Obviously, you had a lot of intellect in that initial ANC group of people, especially Nelson Mandela, and they did walk back from that. It's quite odd to see, for me, to think that the ANC are being viewed as quite reasonable when they've been terrible. But at least they were the EFF. They were occupying exactly the same space that the EFF is occupying now. And I wonder sometimes if we don't just do this dice with the devil for once and for all. And, then all of our futures are clear. If we like living in Zimbabwe 2.0, great. Or that government's going to walk back those policies very, very, very smartly. And to a point, we're starting to see it already. I've made the point many times. You're seeing Malema in a suit. You're seeing them talk about they don't really want to nationalize all the banks. They just want to start a national bank. That was the biggest flip-flop of his life. But, there's going to come a time where we're going to have to kill off this road. We have to go drive down the dead end to see that it's a dead end because the driver doesn't believe that it's a dead end.
Well, R.W. Johnson, the political scientist, he has speculated that an ANC-EFF coalition would not last very long because there'd be a very swift reaction from the markets. The rand would plummet. And it reminds me of a quote by, I can't remember his name, but there was an advisor to President Bill Clinton who said that when he dies, he wants to be reincarnated as the bond market because the bond market is the most powerful political force in the universe. And so there would be a very swift reaction. And South Africa is a small, open economy in a global economic context. And so there would be some major headwinds which could potentially unravel a ANC-EFF coalition before it even gets out of the starting blocks. But that's the game that you're playing, right? It's a game of chicken.
It is a game of chicken.
And it's who swerves first. That's the question.
Yeah, at least he survives. The one who swerves first. The one who swerves second might win, but they might not survive. I think it could be a perfect opportunity, given your position at the Free Market Foundation, my own leanings towards the current system of free markets and open markets, to explain to many people that are watching this, that have heard about the market, as if the market has got one voice and there's one person saying one thing. But I think we need to explain to a lot of people that are watching us what you mean by the market and its reaction. Explain what actually happens. When you say the market would, what are you talking about?
Well, markets are essentially people, right? Behind every investment decision, every portfolio allocation is a human being, an individual making a risk calculation. And markets are driven by one thing, which is return on investment. Can they make a profit? So there's no necessarily intrinsic moral nature to the markets, but they are driven by a keen sense of risk and certainty. And sentiment, as you say, drives market behavior, right? So if there is a perception that private property rights would be weakened under a doomsday coalition, well, then that might mean that your investment certainty is undermined, security of tenure is weak, and that means that long-term profit or the realization of your investment, the return on your investment, could be undermined. So therefore, there are hundreds of other countries that you could turn to allocate your capital, right? Markets don't owe South Africa anything. They're looking for that return on investment. They could go to Turkey, they could go to Mexico. Oh, but there's a new socialist president who's been elected in Mexico. What about Argentina, where there's a libertarian president who's tackling inflation and liberalizing exchange controls and so on, and really opening up Argentina after the highly restrictive decades of the Peronist years, right? So, we need to understand that we're not unique, we're not special. The same laws of economics apply to us as they do to every other country. And we can be like King Lear in the heath, howling at the tempest and raging about how unfair this all is. But that's the reality, right? So we got to navigate through that reality.
Yeah, I just want to correct you on one thing. And you mentioned, well, not quite correct, but just add to one of the things you said. When you said that the market owes us nothing, it does bring to light that there was the one time when the markets felt they owed us something. And that was after 1994, where South Africa had been isolated. The economy had been driven into a terrible position, and suddenly everybody was at the negotiating table. And the accepted idea was that if you choose the right path, we will reward you handsomely. And people were very open in saying that. And it's the one time that the upside to doing the right thing, not the dice with the devil or the doomsday coalitions or anything of the sort, you could see what the rewards were going to be. I wonder if this wouldn't be a good time for the international community to step in and actually dangle a carrot, because I don't see that carrot being dangled. And therefore, I'm seeing a whole lot of politicians wonder why they should do the right thing. You've got a whole lot of people that distrust markets, distrust the West. And I don't see the West making a wonderful case for a government that does the right thing emerging out of South Africa.
Well, incidentally, markets seem to be backing the idea of a government of national unity because they see that as a stabilizing force. But in many respects, the government of national unity will in all likelihood reproduce the failed policy framework that we've been seeing in South Africa, right?
Now, we explained the coalitions. So let's talk about the government of national unity.
Which is a coalition by another name.
Which is a coalition by another name. And if ever a system was perfectly written for if ever there was a perfect role for a perfect actor, it is Cyril Ramaphosa and the idea of a government of national unity, isn't it? Because a government of national unity is who's in control? No one really. We're all in control. It's pure Cyril. He doesn't ever have to make a decision. He can sit there and try and say, come on, let's just all get along, while he never makes a decision. How would a government of national unity work?
Well, it wouldn't really work at all, Mike. That's my argument. So, as you point out, the president, his leadership style is one of consensus seeking. He likes to have everybody in the tent. If you consider his role that he played during the CODESA negotiations, it was all about compromise, the middle ground, and inching things forward. But what South Africa needs now is radical policy reform. We need a fundamental restructuring of our economic policy framework towards liberty, towards free enterprise, securing private property rights, underscoring and upholding the rule of law. But the policy framework that has characterized the last 5 years has been expropriation without compensation, National Health Insurance Act, which was signed into law a mere couple of weeks before the elections itself. We've had the Bella Act in terms of language policy. We've had the Hate Speech Act, which was also hastily signed into law, which I think very much suits the ideological agenda of the ANC to quash free speech in the name of racial harmony and justice, right? So these policies need to be struck from our law books, right? So my concern with the government of national unity is that it will be New Dawn 2.0, that it will be this consultative framework where everybody, all the so-called stakeholders, get to air their grievances and articulate their interests. But what you end up with is a sort of a fudge in the middle ground, a triangulation of all of these divergent interests that really doesn't fundamentally move the needle either way. So you might, for example, take an act like the National Health Insurance Act, and maybe there'll be some concession to amend Section 33 of the Act to enable private healthcare financing firms to still provide a cover, as some of the business associations were arguing for. But then you would still have this massive centrally controlled NHI fund, which is administered at the sole discretion of the health minister, who happens to be an ANC man. You still have deployed cadres within the healthcare system. Nothing is done to check the power of unions. And so, yeah, maybe you get this small win and incremental victory on one aspect of the legislation. But ultimately, what South Africa needs is no NHI Act. We need low-cost benefit options to crowd in the working class and lower middle class consumers who are desperate for private healthcare and who want to move themselves away from the public healthcare system. So that's just one example of how that may play out. Mining industry, we need to scrap the mining charter. Like, the courts have ruled that this is not legally enforceable as a framework. So get rid of it. But I don't see the ANC getting rid of the mining charter. You might have, under the GNU framework, some kind of amended, softened, watered down mining charter, which might help a little bit, but get you nowhere near where we need to be.
Okay, so we start heading towards a confidence and supply arrangement. Another way to put it is a minority government there. The ANC rules with their 40%, and certain of the other parties would vote with them on those issues, as you've outlined. And they now rule with this minority. What do you think that looks like? Do you think decisions will be made that will be made in the best interests of South Africa?
I believe the policies that will be put forward will be in the best interests of the ANC, but there will be a severely weakened ANC, and they would have to negotiate every new piece of legislation on its own terms. And so that would require far more nuanced politics, negotiation, persuasion, compromise, that would actually help to check the worst successes of the ANC government rather than underscore their policy agenda.
It strikes me that we're in this period right now, which is a little bit similar to what happens if you go and you lose all your money. You have one big bet and you lose all of your money and you go home and you've actually got nothing, but you still walk into the same house. You're still driving your nice fancy car and it's still full of petrol, but there's nothing coming in. And it doesn't hit you until your tank hits empty. And your bank asks you for your bond payment, and Eskom asks you to pay your electricity bill at the end of the month. It strikes me that we've got a political equivalent of that within the ANC, where they don't really understand what life is going to look like in a month's time. where right now they're still the 57% party, because even though they lost the election very recently, that hasn't kicked in yet, but it will kick in, and boy, it's going to kick quite hard. I think they even begin to understand what that's going to feel like when when those 71 members of parliament don't get their salary checks at the end of the month. It's going to be quite a shock, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And I think what we're witnessing here is a fundamental paradigm shift. Some analysts have said, well, look, the EFF, MK, ANC, they still have roughly about 63% of the vote, numbers off the top of my head. That hasn't really fundamentally altered the landscape. But I would argue differently. I would say that what we're witnessing is the decline of ANC dominance,
yes,
and the end of the era of ANC hegemony, where the ANC's ideology or its policy agenda filtered down through the rest of society in this kind of natural cascading way, whether it was through the Chapter 9 institutions or through business via cadre deployment or through the courts in terms of this idea of transformationism, a transformania, as Professor Koos-Malan has indicated. And it reminded me very much of the topic of my master's thesis in 2007, which was around the decline of single-party dominance in India. And what we've witnessed in India is quite analogous to South Africa. Even though I studied comparative politics, my main takeaway from that was that it's very difficult to compare political systems, right? Because countries are very complex and multi-layered, and you can't just substitute one for another. But the experience in India was very interesting. So here you had the Indian National Congress that was a self-styled liberation movement, no ordinary political party. Since the late 19th century, it had become the forerunner, the leading organization fighting the anti-colonial movement against the British imperialist system, and then became a political party, had highly charismatic figures who were very much associated with the birth of the new nation, so Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru as well. And then that dynasty extended down to Indira Gandhi as well. And for 30 years, the Congress Party, which was also pretty socialist in its orientation, India was a non-aligned country during the Cold War, but it was fundamentally socialist in its character, a highly interventionist state. For 30 years, Congress enjoyed uninterrupted dominance. There was a very extensive patronage network. Does that sound familiar to the situation in South Africa? Local chiefs or big men who would be able to deliver votes on a consistent basis. So you had this, what political scientists would call a single-party dominant system, a democratic system, but dominated by one very large, very hegemonic political party. And it was in 1947 that India gained independence. 30 years later, 1977, was when the very first multi-party coalition of opposition parties dislodged the Congress Party. And I think that was very significant. Congress, at the time under Indira Gandhi's leadership, had been fighting wars with Pakistan. There was a widespread famine in the country. There was also a state of emergency where civil liberties were curtailed. And when Indira Gandhi announced these snap elections in the midst of the state of emergency, she thought she would win, and she lost. And that moment forever broke the dominance of the Congress Party. They came back later under Indira Gandhi and then her son Rajiv Gandhi, who was assassinated. But they never enjoyed that stranglehold over that grip, that iron grip. And today we see a much diminished Congress Party, and now a very dynamic, competitive party political process with the BJP on the one side and Congress on the other side. So my hope is that South Africa is entering a new era of, fragmented politics, uncertainty, volatility, but also more competitiveness. And to quote R.W. Johnson again, this secularization of politics.
Yes.
That politics becomes more about interests and the interests that you serve rather than just trying to compete within this huge, bloated, slow-moving dominant party.
I fear that we have to do the second part of what India did. I mean, just to illustrate what a ridiculous dynasty the Indian National Congress was that after Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated, they even made his Italian wife the president for a while. It's a joke, right? You know, it was anyone who had a surname Gandhi.
Yeah, president of the party, not of the country.
President of the party. But they did return to power. And when they did return to power, you know, it was like a bad remake. And it was only once India and Indian voters had got that out of their system did they finally liberalize their economy. And today it is one of the strongest economies in the world and has literally taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. I feel that we have to go to the second step, though, which is I'll take a complete and utter, you know, big wager. We were talking about betting earlier. I'll take a big wager on Umkhonto we Sizwe collapsing. ANC will get those votes back. They'll come back with a majority in the next election. They'll be really bad, and then we'll never see them again. That's kind of, to me, the normal trajectory. So let's just see. So everybody bookmark this, and we can have this conversation again in 5 years' time. But I think that we're going to have to go through that, because at some point we have to slay this liberation economics, which is our problem.
Which, again, is what happened in India. So in the early 1990s, India had a balance of payments crisis, and they had about 3 weeks worth of gold reserves left. I think there was even an instance where the ships went to the UK and they were waiting there with the gold ready to pay it over. And that necessitated the finance minister, Manmohan Singh, to introduce a raft of reforms, free market reforms. And up until then, there was this notion of the license permit quota Raj, that they called it. And that was really stifling India's growth potential. And so once all of those barriers were removed, India just absolutely took off. And so, you know, who knows, maybe even an ANC finance minister might institute reforms. I mean, I think we haven't had as much of the pressure to create that situation yet. But
although if anybody needs to, David mentioned the license permit India, you know, please go and have a look at what that was, because we've got a version of it here.
Yes,
we call it BEE, or transformation. Basically, does the government like your partner? In the case of India, was that in order to operate, you needed a permit or a license. And even though the cost of that was negligible and the process existed, the comrade behind the counter had to give it to you. And that created blockages and killed the economy, right? So until they liberalized it. And I have told the story many times, and I won't tell it again, because I'm sure by now people are, you know, sick of me telling the story how in 1991 India couldn't afford to host South Africa and South African when we re-emerged into cricket, only because they were getting out of the Indian National Congress government. So let's get back to South Africa. Here we are. We've understood the pitfalls of government of national unity, which is yet another slow-moving Cyril special where we don't really have any leadership and decisions don't really get made, and that would probably end in tears after 2 years, where the partners will say, we can't work with this guy anymore. The coalitions have got issues on all sides of it. And the other alternative, as you mentioned at the start, is the minority government, the confidence and supply agreement.
No-alition.
No-alition. So nothing formal. Carry on, but we are all watching you, and we can vote against you at any point. Not only against the bad laws that you've got, but we can actually put up a vote of no confidence against the president, and suddenly South Africa will go back to the polls probably in midterm.
The condition of confidence and supply, or the no-alition, would be, if you're the DA, that the ANC must not work with EFF or MK, must not collaborate. That's the sole condition. Very simple condition.
Yeah, okay. I'm a bit afraid of the DA run. You know, to me, if this is done purely at the behest of the DA, it sort of turns into quite a bad form of, it will viewed as quite a bad form of control by the DA over the government, and that might give a little bit of wind in the sails of MK and EFF to say that the ANC are being controlled by the DA.
Well, I would argue that the ANC and, I beg your pardon, the EFF and MK would make that accusation much more stridently against the ANC if it were in a formal coalition with the DA.
But I'm saying
look,
either
you're in
way,
the pockets of the neoliberal imperialists.
As I've said before, either way, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, I think, on this issue. I just wanted to go on while we're talking politics. There's this issue about everybody treating the comrades as if this getting the band back together is inevitable. And I want to know, you're a man that studied these things. Have you ever seen a party split off from the main party and then regroup? If you go back in history, prior, even in the old South Africa, we had many splits off the National Party. Back in the day, you had the Stichte Nasionale Partij, you had the Conservative Party breaking away from the National Party. On the other side of the aisle, you had the United Party, which then split into the Progressive Federal Party, which became the DA, and so on and so forth. And in the new South Africa, we've seen a couple of splits on both sides. I've never once seen a leader say, okay, I'm going back. I'm taking my party back in. I mean, even this dreadful woman down in KZN, the National Freedom Party that broke away from the IFP, even she rather died than put the party back into the IFP. Do you think it's a realistic thing to say this is the mothership and they're all eventually going to rejoin? Have you ever seen it happen before?
Well, certainly not in the South African context. I think that's a very good observation, unless I'm missing
Have you seen it anywhere?
Not that I can recall off the top of my head, Mike.
So I'm quite confused why so many analysts immediately assume that the ANC's best friends are the guys that left the ANC. To my mind, somebody who leaves somebody in a fit of pique is probably your worst enemy, not your best friend.
Yeah, because COPE didn't go back. Yeah. Some COPE members defected back.
A few members might go back, and voters would vote the way they vote. The vote will flow. But this idea of suddenly the ANC get rid of Cyril Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma stands on a podium and says, guys, we're going back. Can you imagine if you're a leader at the MK, now you have to listen to Fikile and Balula? I mean, otherwise we just stay here and run our own little ship. I don't see it happening. I don't see the EFF going back into the ANC. And I've heard this being expounded, and I just don't see it. I don't see how it could happen, because I see no precedent for this.
Yeah, so I think in favor of your argument, political parties, they develop something of a fiefdom of their own, right? And the idea of being absorbed back into some broader structure necessarily means sacrificing that autonomy. The counterpoint I would say to that is, how do you access patronage? Because that's what the main so-called comrade parties are after. That's the glue that's held the ANC together up until now. Yeah. And, in many respects, I think there's a lot of different forces driving the development of MK. One of them is this personal popularity of Zuma himself. I think the other is ethnic Zulu nationalism, which I think is not something a lot of people talk about, but I think is definitely there. But then the other is competing patronage networks, right? Yeah,
there's two ways to get access to those resources. One is you're either in power or you're holding power to ransom. Those are the only two ways that you're going to get your hands on the till. The EFF had done that quite well, where they've held the ANC to ransom with metro areas, and MK could do that with a host of things. But either way, as one of our contributors has said before, both this was really before the absolute emergence of MK, to say both the EFF and the ANC cannot do without corruption. It's almost impossible for them to run their parties. But let's go back to the important bit. The really, really important bit here is, yes, we can debate what's going to happen, and soon something is going to happen, even though I think many in ANC leadership, especially Cyril Ramaphosa, would be very happy if it just stayed like this for the rest of their lives, and then they'd never have to make another decision. But decisions will be made. Clocks are ticking. Let's talk about the economy. Because I think one thing that we have, one conclusion conclusion that we can draw is almost each one of the suggested outcomes is fraught with problems and will create a very unstable South African political outlook for our best hope here is to kick the can down the road for a year or two before it erupts again. If you're an investor, you're not going to be happy to invest in South Africa maybe in the very short term, but not in the medium or the long term, because you can see these problems on the horizon. What do you see for the South African economy, David?
Well, what I think is very interesting, and we remain very skeptical of formal coalitions, as we've discussed today, is that if the coalition discussions do proceed, what preconditions would be on the table in order for that to happen, right? So we as the Free Market Foundation have a core set of mostly economic policy recommendations that we would like to see come to fruition. So in terms of the economy, what is the biggest concentration risk, the biggest choke point for South Africa? It's the state-owned enterprises. Eskom, they seem to have resolved some of the major load shedding problems, at least for now, but there remain some very significant problems within that utility that needs to be unbundled. We need to see far greater levels of privatization. I think some of the initial privatization of generation capacity has actually helped to improve supply. Unfortunately, because of the deindustrialization of South Africa, that's also led to a decrease in demand. But if we do see an uptick in economic growth, we're going to need much more readily available and dispatchable energy, and we need more competition in energy markets. Ports and rail, these are the lifeblood of a modern economy. These are like the arteries that feed goods throughout this very vast country that we live in. And what we've seen is that our rail network has been systematically stripped by criminal syndicates, and there are major blockages in South Africa's ports. I saw a report recently that the port in Cape Town has been ranked amongst the lowest in a global index of ports. I think this is a World Bank index. And yet Cape Town itself is pretty well run. The province of the Western Cape is very well run as well. And yet the national government has control over this asset through Transnet, right? The same with passenger rail and PRASA. All of those poor people living on the Cape Flats, they used to be able to take a train into downtown Cape Town. Now they can't do that anymore because the trains have been burnt or the lines have been stripped. So federal powers, much more control by the city of Cape Town, by the Western Cape provincial government, I think would be a critical concession to gain from these negotiations, if it is indeed what they decide to do, which is go ahead with a coalition government. Again, our preference is for no coalition, but if you're going to do coalition, then you need to extract some significant concessions. The other issue around the economy is our sky-high levels of unemployment. I think it's around 34% at the moment. That's just on the narrow definition, right? So we need to get millions of people into the labor market. And how do we do that? Through labor market liberalization. And we as the Free Market Foundation for many years have been arguing for a job seekers exemption certificate, JSEC. Now the DA has a similar proposal in their manifesto, which would essentially exempt unemployed young people from the highly restrictive labor laws that currently lock them out of the labor market. This would be a voluntary thing. You wouldn't need to repeal the Labor Relations Act or the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. You would just need to empower a young person to voluntarily exempt themselves from these laws, to say, I'm willing to work at any price, don't care what the minimum wage says, under any conditions, because I need a job, which is overwhelmingly one of the biggest problems in our economy. And then the other would be, I think, if you want to extract a concession, get the expropriation bill or the expropriation act repealed, withdrawn, to send a very clear signal that the new government takes private property rights seriously, and that ownership is a right that all South Africans deserve, rather than something that is granted at the discretion of the government. Same with NHI.
Do you see any of this happening? Are you optimistic in the short and medium term?
Well, look, I think that's one of the reasons why we've been arguing for the no-alition, because we feel that perhaps the bargaining position of the relative parties might be very constrained, and that some of these radical reforms might be impossible to implement. So I think in that sense, we're a bit skeptical. We'd certainly welcome some of these changes that are recommended. So federalism, labor market deregulation, private property rights, health, and then also privatization. I think that those would be really the key preconditions that would need to be in place for any coalition to be successful. Whether or not those actually happen is a different question altogether.
And ladies and gentlemen, there's no doubt that if the ANC found it within themselves to do those liberalizations of this economy, we would be back up at 5% growth in a very short period of time. South Africa is sitting with so many opportunities, but we are missing them all because we have got complete policy paralysis. So let's hope that this election will have proven to our political masters that they need to put the country first for once. David and Ansara, thank you so much for coming. Let's hope that David's no-alition prevails. To everybody that's watched this today, support Pace Car Rental, subscribe and like. If you're here now, you might as well. And we'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.